She knew it the moment she met him. Ali MacGraw has said it plainly, decades later, that something about Steve McQueen felt chemical, dangerous, impossible to resist, and that some deep instinct in her already knew she was walking straight into serious trouble long before the cameras ever started rolling. She was right. What followed was a marriage built on passion, control, addiction, and a silence she kept for years out of pure fear of losing him. Now, at 87, Ali MacGraw has finally laid it all out in her own words. The real cost of loving the man the world called the King of Cool. So before we get to what she actually said, let's go back to where her story began, long before Steve McQueen ever walked into a room and changed the direction of her entire life. Ali MacGraw was born in Bedford Village, New York, in 1939, into a household far less glamorous than the life she'd eventually lead. Her father struggled with alcoholism, and the constant tension between her parents left her with a fragile sense of self-worth that would follow her well into adulthood, a quiet undercurrent of not quite enough that she has said shaped far more of her adult choices than she recognized at the time. She found an early escape in modeling, catching the attention of legendary fashion editor Diana Vreeland, who helped guide her into the industry and, eventually, into film. First working behind the scenes as a stylist and photo assistant before anyone thought to put her in front of a camera herself. Her breakout came in 1969 with Goodbye Columbus, a performance sharp enough to catch the eye of Robert Evans, then the head of production at Paramount Pictures. Evans didn't just cast her in his next film, he married her that same year, and together they had a son, Joshua, in 1971. Then came Love Story. Released in 1970, the film turned Ali MacGraw into one of the defining faces of American cinema almost overnight. Her performance as a dying young student opposite Ryan O'Neal, grossing well over $100 million worldwide, and cementing a tagline that an entire generation still quotes. By her early 30s, she had a thriving career, a powerful husband, and a young son. On paper, it looked like the life had already peaked in the best possible way. What she couldn't have known was that the next role Evans handed her would unravel every piece of it. In 1972, Evans secured Ali a starring role opposite Steve McQueen in The Getaway, a decision he almost certainly regretted for the rest of his life. McQueen, 12 years older than Ali, was already the biggest movie star on the planet, a man whose own childhood read almost like a dare from fate itself. Born in Indiana in 1930, he was abandoned by his father, a stunt pilot who left the family before he was even born and left largely in the care of relatives after his alcoholic mother proved unable to raise him. When he was finally reunited with her at age 8, it wasn't a rescue. It came with a violent stepfather and a childhood marked by partial deafness and undiagnosed dyslexia that made school nearly impossible to survive. By 14, after years of petty theft, stolen cars, and living on the street for weeks at a time, his mother had him remanded to Boys Republic, a reform school for troubled teenagers in California. He later called it, without irony, the best thing that ever happened to him, the place that finally gave a wild, unloved kid some kind of structure. He once put it more bluntly than that. When a kid doesn't have any love when he's small, he said, he begins to wonder if he's good enough. That's what happened to me. He carried that wound his entire life, even at the absolute height of his fame. And years later, as one of the wealthiest actors alive, he quietly kept returning to Boys Republic to fund scholarships and mentor the boys living through exactly what he had. The Marines came next, discipline he desperately needed, even as his rebellious streak got him demoted and thrown in the brig more than once for going AWOL. From there, an almost impossible climb. Small parts, a short-lived television western called Wanted, Dead or Alive, and then a scene-stealing supporting role in The Magnificent Seven, where he reportedly outmaneuvered his own co-star for the camera's attention just by fidgeting with his hat in every shared frame. He once admitted, without much modesty, exactly what drove him. "The main thing I've always wanted to do," he said, "is to be the best actor in the business, even better than the best." By the time he starred in The Great Escape and later Bullet, with its motorcycle jump and car chase sequences he insisted on performing largely himself, Steve McQueen wasn't just famous, he was untouchable. A man whose off-screen obsession with motorcycles and race cars became as central to his mythology as any film role. He competed in real off-road motorcycle races under a fake name, just to avoid the fuss of being recognized, rode in the grueling Baja 1000, and eventually funded and starred in Le Mans, a passion project about endurance racing he insisted on filming with real drivers and real speed rather than any studio shortcut, once saying flatly that if they were going to make the film at all, it had to be pure, with none of the usual Hollywood nonsense. He once said the only time he truly relaxed was behind the wheel at speed, because staying calm in real danger was the only version of peace he'd ever fully trusted. That was the man Ali MacGraw was suddenly working across from in the Texas heat in 1972. She has said their chemistry was undeniable from the first moment, describing it later simply as chemical, the kind of pull that made heads turn the second he walked into any room. Their affair began almost as soon as filming did, and it became the most talked about romance in Hollywood almost overnight. Publicity that turned The Getaway into a box office hit, even as it quietly detonated Ali's marriage. By the end of that year, she filed for divorce from Evans, a betrayal that blindsided the man who had built her entire career, a rupture so dramatic it later became its own subplot in a television series about Evans decades afterward. In July of 1973, Ali MacGraw and Steve McQueen married. From the outside, it looked like the ultimate Hollywood fairy tale. Two of the industry's biggest stars finally together. The reality, almost immediately, told a different story. McQueen insisted on a prenuptial agreement guaranteeing she'd walk away with nothing if the marriage ended. And more than that, he demanded she give up acting entirely. At the absolute peak of her career, Ali agreed, later admitting she did it purely out of fear, terrified that saying no might cost her the man himself. He was the biggest movie star in the world," she said years afterward, "and he didn't want me to work." Their early years in a secluded Malibu beach house looked idyllic from a distance. Barbecues on the sand, quiet nights with a small circle of friends. But the cracks came fast. McQueen's childhood had left him with a deep distrust of women, and his jealousy, Ali later recalled, could flare over something as small as a glance in another man's direction. The paradox was cruel. He himself flirted openly with other women throughout their marriage, and was widely rumored to have multiple affairs, even while demanding total devotion from her. Ali gave up premieres, scripts, and the career she'd built from nothing, and became instead a full-time homemaker, raising her son while managing McQueen's needs around the clock. In her own words, she played cook, cleaning lady, and simple woman to the hilt, roles that slowly hollowed her out, even as she told herself it was worth it for love. The isolation compounded everything. McQueen's drinking and drug use worsened as the years went on, and Ali, increasingly trapped and terrified of speaking up in case it drove him away for good, began drinking heavily herself just to survive the loneliness inside a marriage that looked, from every magazine cover, like a fairy tale still very much alive. By the mid-1970s, the home that had once felt like a sanctuary had gone quiet in the worst possible way, filled with suspicion instead of conversation. And Ali later admitted she stayed silent for years, purely out of fear that speaking her mind would end in abandonment. By 1976, McQueen was still the man on movie posters, still the effortless icon behind the wheel in Bullet or racing across the screen in The Great Escape. But at home, the addictions had taken firmer hold. He disappeared for nights at a time into drinking and drugs, returning volatile and distant. Ali, who had already surrendered so much of herself to keep the marriage intact, found herself sinking into her own despair, and the persistent rumors of his infidelities eventually became impossible to keep denying. Humiliated and desperate for some scrap of comfort, she has admitted that she, too, eventually sought companionship outside the marriage, a mutual unraveling that replaced whatever passion had once existed with a slow, corrosive cycle of resentment. By 1977, Ali had reached her limit. She told McQueen she wanted to reclaim the acting career she'd given up for him, a decision that was as much about reclaiming herself as it was about work. According to biographer Marshall Terrell, McQueen's response was ice-cold and immediate. In that case, he reportedly told her, "We are filing for divorce." Whatever illusion remained about the marriage collapsed in that single sentence, confirming the fear she'd carried silently for years, that her own voice had never really mattered to him at all. Ali went on to accept a role in Convoy, a decision that made any reconciliation impossible, and by 1978, after 5 years defined as much by control and jealousy as by genuine passion, the divorce was finalized. 2 years later, tragedy struck, in a far more permanent way. In December of 1979, after months of unexplained exhaustion, on what would be his final film shoot. Doctors delivered Steve McQueen a diagnosis with no good options attached to it: pleural mesothelioma, a rare aggressive cancer of the lung lining, almost always caused by asbestos. Likely traced back to the asbestos pipelagging he'd stripped by hand as a young Marine, the insulated sound stages he'd worked on for 2 decades, and the flame-retardant racing suits he'd worn through a lifetime of the one hobby that had always made him feel most alive. American doctors told him plainly there was nothing more conventional medicine could offer. Rather than accept that, McQueen quietly slipped away to a controversial clinic near Tijuana, Mexico, checking in under the alias Sam Shepard to keep the press off his trail, and submitting to a grueling, unproven regimen of Laetrile daily injections of animal cell extract, dozens of vitamins, and coffee enemas administered by a doctor whose only actual medical license in orthodontics had already been revoked years earlier. He kept the diagnosis secret from almost everyone outside his innermost circle until a tabloid finally tracked him down and forced his hand. Even then, in a recorded message to fans, he insisted he was fighting his way back, thanking Mexico for showing the world a new way to battle cancer. It didn't work. By November of 1980, with tumors that had spread from his abdomen up through his neck, McQueen underwent a last, desperate surgery to remove them, one weighing nearly 5 pounds on its own. He seemed, briefly, almost impossibly to be improving, right after the operation, talking in good spirits. Then, in the early hours of November 7th, 1980, 3 hours after that surgery ended, Steve McQueen suffered a heart attack and died in a clinic in Juarez, Mexico. He was 50 years old. He had, in fact, remarried only months earlier to model Barbara Minty, but it was Allie, divorced from him for 2 years by then, who the world still instinctively pictured standing beside him. News of his death shocked an industry that had never quite known what to do with a man that magnetic and that broken at the same time. When McQueen died in November of 1980, Allie MacGraw was only 41, a woman grieving a man she'd already legally left behind, but never fully stopped loving. Despite everything, the control, the jealousy, the betrayals on both sides, she had loved him profoundly, and decades later, she offered one of the most quietly devastating reflections of her entire life. "I wish we had both grown old sober," she said, a single sentence carrying the weight of every year they never got the chance to have. Professionally, she tried to move forward, taking roles in Convoy and, later, a recurring arc on the primetime soap Dynasty in 1984. But Hollywood's appetite for her had cooled, and she found herself increasingly overlooked in an industry that had once crowned her its brightest new star. By the early 1990s, her own drinking had become a cage rather than a comfort, and she made the decision to enter treatment at the Betty Ford Center, beginning a long, unglamorous process of confronting not just her addiction, but the accumulated weight of every relationship that had led her there. In 1991, she published her memoir, Moving Pictures, an unflinching account of her childhood, her marriages, and the real cost of the fame the world had always assumed she'd enjoyed without consequence. It became a bestseller, resonating with readers who recognized their own struggles with love and loss inside her story. By 1994, she'd left Hollywood behind, almost entirely relocating to Santa Fe, New Mexico, trading film sets for gardening, painting, and a slower, quieter kind of life she'd never really had the chance to live before. It was there, far from the industry that had built and nearly broken her, that Ally MacGraw finally found something like peace. She has now been sober for more than 30 years, a milestone she once genuinely doubted she'd ever reach. I used to rewrite the past and fantasize about the future, she reflected years later, but now I believe in living fully to the very best of my ability. I feel very blessed. She never remarried, choosing instead to invest in herself and in the friendships that had quietly outlasted every romance. Even now, at 87, Ally MacGraw has never tried to sand down the truth of what she lived through. She still describes the pull she felt toward Steve McQueen as chemical, still admits she sensed trouble the moment they met, and still refuses to pretend the marriage was only darkness. There were wonderful days, and dreadful days, she has said. I'm not a victim in any way. There were many times that were just wonderful, and there were many times that were just ghastly. That honesty, more than any single scandal or headline, is what has given her story a weight that outlasts the tabloids that once chased it. What makes Ally MacGraw's account so striking now isn't the scandal of it at all. It's the clarity. She isn't asking anyone to feel sorry for her, and she isn't rewriting a man she genuinely loved into a villain just because loving him nearly cost her everything. Plenty of people spend their later years either defending a painful marriage or condemning it outright. Ally has done neither. She has simply insisted on holding both truths at once, the wonderful and the ghastly, the man who made her feel more alive than anyone ever had, and the man whose control very nearly erased her entirely, without flattening either one into a simpler story than the truth actually was. That's really the horror at the center of her story, and also, strangely, its most hopeful lesson. The horror was never really Steve McQueen himself. It was how completely a woman at the absolute height of her own power could be talked into disappearing for the sake of being loved, and how long it can take to find your way back out of that once you finally realize what happened. Ally MacGraw found her way out. It took a divorce, a decade of numbing the pain with alcohol, a stay at the Betty Ford Center, and years of quiet, unglamorous work in Santa Fe most of the public never saw. But she came out the other side, able to say without flinching that she loved deeply, lost painfully, and is not a victim of any of it. A distinction only real distance and real healing can actually earn. Steve McQueen remains in the world's memory, the king of cool, forever, behind the wheel, forever unbothered, frozen in the amber of Bullitt and The Great Escape. But the woman who actually shared a home with him has given us something far more valuable than the legend. She's given us the whole man, wounded and magnetic in equal measure, and the honest, hard-won peace she finally built for herself, decade by sober decade, long after he was gone. At 87, Ally MacGraw isn't telling this story to shock anyone. She's telling it because she's finally old enough and finally free enough to let the whole truth stand exactly as complicated as it always actually was. If Ally MacGraw's courage in telling this story moved you, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.